They told you that apologizing makes you brave, that admitting you were wrong shows strength, that bowing your head and opening your chest to scrutiny means you've evolved. They said it was a sign of maturity, of moral clarity, of emotional intelligence, and you believed them. You were told that to own your mistakes is to rise above them, that to be vulnerable is to be powerful, that to say, "I'm sorry," makes you human, and humans, after all, are flawed. So you confessed, you explained, you wept, maybe not in public, but in spirit, and you thought it was over, but it wasn't, because something strange happened the moment you apologized. The world didn't congratulate you for your honesty. It leaned in, it remembered what you did, questioned your judgment, it labeled you the one who admitted guilt. And even those who claimed to forgive didn't forget. You had given them something, confirmation, not of your growth, but of your error, and once that confirmation is made public, it can never be undone. Here's the truth no one tells you. An apology is not just an act of conscience. It's a transfer of power, and Machiavelli understood this better than anyone. He believed that, in the pursuit of power, sincerity is a liability, and humility is often a costume in his world, and ours. An apology doesn't cleanse. It confirms. It doesn't restore your image. It reduces it. Because when you apologize, you're not just admitting fault. You're elevating the other person. You're crowning them the moral superior. And if you do it in public, you're giving the mob a gavel. Machiavelli would say, never apologize unless you're lying. Because if you're lying, you're not giving them your truth. You're giving them a story, a version, a tool. And tools can be shaped, bent, sharpened. But if you're sincere, if your apology is real, then you've handed over the one thing you may never get back. Your frame. We live in a culture that celebrates confession, but secretly feeds on it. Every apology becomes a headline, a sound bite, a brand, not a brand of recovery, but of wrongdoing. And when that brand is burned into memory, no amount of growth can erase it. They'll still call you by your lowest moment. This is the world Machiavelli warned us about, a world where truth is not rewarded, but exploited, where moral superiority is used not for justice, but for control. A world where forgiveness is never free, it's a form of ownership. And so begins the descent. A man apologizes thinking he's restoring trust, but he's only proving he was guilty. He bends the knee, and they remember the posture, not the reason. This isn't a call to become heartless. It's a call to become aware, because when the stakes are high, when reputation, influence, and legacy are on the line, an apology is not an act of virtue. It's a weapon, sometimes aimed outward, but most often aimed inward. So before you say, "I'm sorry," ask yourself, are you apologizing to make peace or to survive? Are you reclaiming trust or surrendering power? And more importantly, who told you that confession makes you strong? Because the people who hold real power rarely apologize, and when they do, it's not for honesty, it's for strategy. Welcome to the psychological battlefield. The apology is the opening move. An apology feels like a moral act, but beneath the surface, it functions more like a transaction, one that is often poorly negotiated by the person giving it. At its core, an apology is a structured ritual. First, the confessor identifies guilt. Then, they submit to judgment. Finally, they surrender the outcome to someone else's approval. Guilt gives submission, gives judgment. That's the sequence. But what most people don't realize is that this sequence doesn't restore balance. It restructures power. When someone says, "I'm sorry, I was wrong, and you were right," they're not just admitting fault, they're offering something far more valuable: moral authority. And in hierarchical systems, whether in politics, corporate structures, relationships, or public perception, moral authority is a form of social capital. Once transferred, it rarely returns. This is why apologies often don't work the way we expect. The one who apologizes imagines the act will resolve the tension, level the playing field, and allow for healing. But in reality, that's rarely what happens. Instead, the person receiving the apology receives a status boost. They become the one who was wronged, the one whose judgment was validated, the one who now holds emotional leverage, and leverage is a dangerous thing in the wrong hands. Historically, public apologies have been less about reconciliation and more about humiliation. Consider Galileo, forced to recant his heliocentric views under the weight of the Inquisition, not because his science was flawed, but because the Church needed dominance reaffirmed. His apology wasn't just a personal submission, it was a political performance to re-establish the Church's control over truth itself centuries later. In more modern arenas, the dynamics remain strikingly similar. CEOs step down, not always because they are criminally culpable, but because public perception demands a ritual sacrifice. A public apology becomes a form of theater, not for accountability, but for appeasement. The crowd doesn't necessarily want truth. It wants someone to kneel, and once you kneel, you can't lead. The anatomy of an apology, when dissected, reveals its true function. It creates a frame shift before the apology. You may have been seen as powerful, assertive, or even defiant. After it, you're someone seeking redemption. You've moved from being a self-directed actor to being someone awaiting judgment. And the danger lies in this shift, because the moment you hand over judgment, you surrender control. People often talk about apologies as courageous, but in environments where power is currency, apologies signal weakness. This doesn't mean you should never admit fault, but it does mean that how you admit fault determines what happens next. Imagine two generals after a battle. One says, "I take full responsibility for this failure. I apologize to the men, to the nation, and to our allies." The other says, "The outcome wasn't what we planned. We will adjust tactics and strike again." Harder and wiser, both acknowledge something went wrong, but only one remains in commanding personal relationships. This power transaction plays out just as ruthlessly. Think of the phrase, "You were right, I was wrong." It sounds noble, but it also inverts the power dynamic instantly. The one who hears it now holds the upper hand emotionally, morally, and often strategically. That moment is stored away, even subconsciously, as evidence. It becomes a bargaining chip, a reference point, a weapon in future conflicts. And the one who said it? They're now operating under a debt of credibility. This is why habitual apologizers often find themselves disrespected, not because they lack integrity, but because they overspend their credibility. Each apology chips away at their stature, until there's little left but the memory of repeated submission. In the world of Machiavelli, this would be unforgivable. To apologize once is a rare concession. To apologize often is a pattern of weakness, and in power dynamics, patterns are everything. So, what then is the alternative? It's not stubbornness or arrogance, it's reframing. It's taking responsibility through action rather than confession. It's saying, "I see what went wrong, and I've corrected it," instead of, "I was wrong, and I beg your understanding." Because when you offer correction, you maintain authority. When you offer apology, you invite judgment. That difference may seem subtle, but it determines whether you rise or fall in the eyes of others. Anatomy of an apology is not just a matter of words. It's a psychological blueprint of how we assign guilt, how we transfer authority, and how we signal our place in the social order. And once you understand that, you can choose whether to play the role of the confessor or the one who listens silently, strategically, and without ever surrendering the crown. There's a modern myth we've all been fed, that to be truly accountable, you must apologize. That taking responsibility without remorse is cold, robotic, maybe even sociopathic. And yet, the people who hold the most power in the world almost never apologize. Not sincerely, not publicly, not often. Why? Because they understand something most people don't. Responsibility is not the same as apology. Responsibility is about results. Apology is about emotion. One fixes the problem, the other feeds perception, and when perception becomes currency, emotions get weaponized. Machiavellian thinking separates these two concepts completely. Responsibility is action. It's course correction. It's evaluating what went wrong and adjusting. Decisively apology, however, is something different. It's a public expression of guilt, one that often invites more harm than healing. Consider this. A CEO presides over a scandal. The public is outraged. The media smells blood. There are two paths. One CEO steps forward with tears in her voice. I take full responsibility. I'm sorry for the harm caused. She apologizes on camera, headlines flood in, she trends. She becomes a meme, and within weeks, she's replaced. Another CEO says, we've identified the issue and already enacted internal reforms to prevent recurrence. No apology, no emotion, just action. She disappears from headlines within days. Why? Because she didn't feed the spectacle. She removed the fuel from the fire. She solved the problem without lowering her status. This is the Machiavellian method. Fix it quietly, effectively, and without ceremony. Public apologies are often less about accountability and more about narrative control. But narrative is a game. You rarely win once you've already conceded guilt. That's why the most powerful figures in business, politics, and military strategy so often issue statements that sound like action plans, not confessions. They know that once you give the world a reason to frame you as guilty, even emotionally, they will run with it, and they will not stop now. Contrast this with the scapegoat. Every institution has one. The employee forced to fall on their sword so the brand survives. The politician who takes responsibility for the failure of an entire department. The therapist who tells you. Healing begins with expressing remorse, but in each case, what's really happening is ritual sacrifice. The apology becomes the offering. It buys the crowd's temporary silence, but not their lasting respect. Responsibility, in its purest form, isn't dramatic. It doesn't beg for understanding. It doesn't call attention to itself. It operates in silence. It reviews the data, makes adjustments, and moves forward. And the beauty of this approach is that it restores control without ever having to admit defeat. That's the high-power path. Correction without confession. We admire those who quietly turn things around without announcing their guilt. The entrepreneur who vanishes after a product failure, then returns a year later with something revolutionary. The leader who doesn't give interviews but fixes the system. The partner who doesn't beg for forgiveness but changes their behavior so completely that the past becomes irrelevant. In these cases, responsibility is communicated not through words, but through transformation, and transformation, when done correctly, erases the need for apology. This is why Machiavelli would never say, I'm sorry, unless it served a purpose. Not because he lacked empathy, but because he understood structure. In systems of power, every word becomes a signal. Every admission creates leverage for someone else. Apologies are often demanded not to promote healing, but to establish hierarchy. They are tools of control, and the moment you offer one, you shift the frame from leader to defendant, from actor to judged. Responsibility, on the other hand, allows you to remain the protagonist. You are still directing the story. You are still shaping the outcome in a world obsessed with optics. Responsibility has become a backstage act, but that's where real power moves happen, behind the curtain, quietly, intentionally, with no applause needed. So the next time the world expects you to perform your guilt, ask yourself, would you rather be judged, or would you rather adjust? Machiavelli chose action over admission, and in doing so, he preserved his most valuable asset: leverage. Most people apologize to be forgiven. Machiavelli would apologize to be feared again. The sincere apology is often a declaration of defeat. It signals vulnerability, guilt, and the hope for redemption. But the Machiavellian apology is something altogether different. It is not an expression of remorse. It is a calculation, a mask, a Trojan horse. Its purpose is not to heal relationships, but to re-enter rooms you were once locked out of. This is the apology as performance, not confession. And when done correctly, it becomes one of the most powerful manipulations in human psychology, because here's what people don't understand. Apologies don't just admit guilt, They reframe perception, and perception, in a world ruled by optics, is more powerful than truth. When Machiavelli advised rulers to appear virtuous, even if they were not, he wasn't endorsing hypocrisy, he was teaching survival. To recognize traps, one must be a fox. To frighten wolves, a lion. But the cleverest predators are those who look like neither. Sometimes the fox must look like a lamb. That's where the fake apology comes in. It begins softly, an admission, not of the act, but of its unintended consequences. Regret not for what was done, but for how it was perceived. A tone not of collapse, but of humility rehearsed to perfection. The public exhales the tension, drops defenses lower. Sympathy creeps in, but while the crowd feels resolution, the strategist feels only access. The apology was never about healing. It was about getting close again, close enough to reposition, influence, and reclaim lost ground. History is full of these performances. Think of politicians embroiled in scandal, who offer a carefully crafted apology, just vague enough to avoid legal repercussions, just emotional enough to appear human. They say things like, "Mistakes were made," or "I regret how this was received." No direct admission, no real ownership, but the public, craving emotional closure, accepts it. They mistake the softness of tone for sincerity of heart, and just like that, the narrative shifts. The crowd says, "At least he owned it." But what he actually did was reset the board. This is why some of the most manipulative figures in history have mastered the apology. Cult leaders who weep on camera after internal abuse allegations, not to take accountability, but to deepen their grip on their followers. Celebrities who issue tearful statements, not because they believe what they're saying, but because their team ran the analytics. The apology isn't a surrender, it's a strategic pause before a comeback. In each of these cases, the apology is crafted for effect, not truth. It is calculated to disarm, to confuse, to reposition, because once you look remorseful, you stop looking dangerous, and the moment they stop fearing you, they let you back in. This is the essence of Machiavellian leverage. Turn vulnerability into camouflage. A master manipulator will apologize at the exact moment when the enemy feels strongest. He will make himself look defeated, humbled, even humiliated. But it's bait. A temporary retreat, a psychological feint, because while they're basking in their moral high ground, he is recalibrating, planning his next move behind the veil of sincerity. Sometimes, the fake apology is delivered privately, one-on-one, with no witnesses. Other times, it's a grand public display, crafted for maximum narrative impact. But in either case, it works because most people are desperate to believe in redemption. The audience wants to forgive, not because they are kind, but because it gives them power. And once they feel they've granted you mercy, they become emotionally invested in your recovery. Now they are less likely to challenge you again, because doing so would mean admitting they were wrong to forgive you. That is how one fake apology can buy not just access, but loyalty. This tactic is used in negotiations, in political debates, in corporate scandals. The words change, the language evolves, but the mechanism stays the same. Offer just enough regret to shift the frame, never enough to shift control. There's a moment in the dance of perception when your enemy believes they've conquered you, when they think they've drawn blood. That is the precise moment when the apology should be deployed, not to validate their dominance, but to feed it briefly so that you can slip past their guard in warfare. It's the retreat that lures the army into the trap in psychology. It's the regret that lures the mind into complacency. This is the apology not as surrender, but as strategy. And this is what separates the Machiavellian mind from the honest one. Where the average person apologizes to alleviate guilt, the Machiavellian apologizes to accumulate advantage. So, the next time you hear a powerful figure say they're sorry, ask yourself, what do they gain from appearing broken? Because if the answer is access, sympathy, or silence, then what you just witnessed wasn't an apology, it was an opening move in the next chapter of control. A public apology feels like the right thing to do, It feels brave, mature, responsible. We're told it's the ultimate form of growth, owning your mistake in front of others, taking accountability, showing remorse, but that's not what actually happens. What really happens is this. The moment you apologize publicly, you no longer control the narrative. You have surrendered your frame. And the frame, the context in which people perceive your actions, is everything. Because once your apology is public, it becomes permanent record. It's archived, it's clipped, it's quoted endlessly, and without context. Your words get reused long after your growth has happened. Long after your intentions have evolved. What you meant is no longer relevant. What you said is what you are. That's the trap of the modern apology in today's culture. The call to own it sounds virtuous, but the reality is darker. It's not about forgiveness, it's about confirmation. The public isn't asking you to apologize so they can let it go. They're asking you to validate their judgment of you. They want you to kneel, not because it will fix things, but because it proves they were right to be angry. This is the modern bloodsport of digital confession. The moment you say, "I was wrong," you've entered a courtroom with no judge, no jury, and no end date. And the crowd? They're not looking for restoration. They're looking for spectacle. Take a moment to examine how apologies play out in public culture. The celebrity who tweets a heartfelt statement, the CEO who does the press tour, the influencer who posts a tearful video. What happens next? Not redemption, not repair, repetition. The clips circulate, the quote becomes a punchline. Isn't that the guy who cried about his brand collapse? Isn't she the one who apologized for being problematic? Even if their careers recover, their identity doesn't, because now their name is tied to that moment. They've been branded, not as human, but as broken. And worse, forgiveness never fully arrives, because forgiveness requires closure. But the public doesn't want closure. They want to keep the file open. They want to keep revisiting the crime in a culture where attention is power. Outrage must be kept alive. This is why public apologies don't redeem you. They reduce you. They reframe you as lesser, as guilty, as the one who bowed, even if you were right in parts. Even if your intentions were misunderstood, none of that matters. You've now confirmed the narrative that you were in the wrong. And the mob was righteous. Machiavelli would have seen this clearly. To apologize publicly is to relinquish sovereignty over your own reputation. It's to allow your enemy, not just a person, but the collective perception of people, to define you. And once they define you, you're living in their frame in politics. This is strategic suicide. The moment a politician apologizes publicly, they don't just lose momentum, they lose the power to lead. Their words are brought up in debates, replayed in attack ads, analyzed endlessly. They can win the argument, win the policy, even win the election, but they'll never win back. The image of strength in corporate life. A public apology signals weakness to shareholders, uncertainty to the market, and blood in the water to competitors. It tells the world, I made a mistake, and I am not in control of the narrative anymore. Even in personal life, this holds true once you apologize publicly on social media. At the dinner table, in front of the friend group, you've handed over the script. You are no longer the author of your character, everyone else is. They may smile and say, "We appreciate your honesty," but what they're actually thinking is, "Noted, you confirmed it." That's why Machiavelli would never apologize in public. He understood that perception is stronger than principle, that it's not the apology that heals, but the power you retain after the damage. And once you apologize in front of others, you've sacrificed the most critical resource you have, ambiguity. Without ambiguity, people stop questioning. They start defining, and once they define you, they don't need to forgive you. They just need to categorize you into boxes, into roles, into the hierarchy they understand. And in that structure, you are beneath them. So here's the brutal truth. Public apologies are not about accountability. They are about hierarchy. And if you're the one doing the apologizing, you're no longer leading the room. You're reacting to it. You become the cautionary tale, the object lesson, the symbol of what happens when someone breaks the unspoken. Rules of public morality, not forgiven, just framed forever. In a world addicted to explanation, silence is radical. In a culture obsessed with statements, clarifications, confessions, and commentary, the refusal to speak becomes an act of psychological defiance. Silence doesn't resolve tension, it amplifies. It doesn't offer comfort, it creates curiosity. And that curiosity becomes power. This is the psychology of silence. When you say nothing, the world starts to speak for you. They project, they guess, they analyze in your absence of confession. They supply their own narrative, and that narrative is always a mirror revealing more about their fears, their biases, their insecurities than it does about you. This is why silence is not weakness. It is control. When someone expects an apology and doesn't receive one, they don't walk away in peace. They walk away in uncertainty. Did you not care? Did you not agree? Were you too arrogant to admit it? Or too strategic to give them what they wanted? The unanswered question becomes the leash, and while they tug at it, you're already gone free, undefined, and dangerously unpinned in power. Dynamics. Doubt is often more effective than closure. Closure gives people resolution. It allows them to move on, to classify you, to feel superior. But doubt? Doubt lingers. It haunts. It replays in their mind because the story is still open, and as long as the story is open, you still occupy space in their imagination. Silence becomes a kind of mirror, a psychological weapon. The more someone tries to provoke a response, and the more they receive none, the more they begin to see themselves in the absence, their frustration, their rage, their emotional need for validation. And that's where power flips, because if you say nothing, you are no longer being defined. You are being studied. You are no longer defending yourself. You are being examined, interpreted, and feared. Think of historical leaders who mastered silence. When Julius Caesar was accused of corruption early in his rise, he didn't rush to respond. He let the accusations build, let the tension rise, and only when he had the Senate in his favor did he speak. And by then, his voice wasn't defensive, it was decisive. Because silence had done the work for him. Or consider a more modern example. Steve Jobs, in his darkest moments, fired from Apple. Criticized for his management, he didn't fight back with apologies or explain himself to the press. He vanished, rebuilt, evolved, and when he returned, he didn't need to justify his past. His results rewrote the narrative. This is the art of silence. It's not passive, it's strategic. Silence creates fog. And fog is hard to attack. You cannot fight what you cannot define. You cannot pin down someone who refuses to be categorized. And the more people attempt to force an answer, the more unstable they begin to appear. It's a kind of psychological aikido, using their energy, their insistence, their emotional demands against them. While they unravel in pursuit of clarity, you remain composed, ambiguous, incomplete. That's where real dominance lives. We often think silence is cowardice, but Machiavelli would argue the opposite. Silence is not avoidance, it is containment. It is not surrender, it is framing when done deliberately. Silence says, I don't need your permission to move forward. I don't need to plead my innocence and letting the dust settle on its own, and when it does, I will still be standing. This terrifies people, because without your words to hold onto, they are left only with their own interpretations, and interpretation is volatile. It creates instability. That instability, it becomes your advantage. You are no longer predictable. You are now a paradox, and people do not destroy paradoxes. They obsess over them. They analyze them. They try to solve them, which means they are always facing you, even if you've turned away. This is how silence becomes reputation armor. A misunderstood figure is harder to assassinate than a transparent one, because once you are fully known, you are fully killable. Your weakness is mapped, your error is documented, your identity is fixed. But if you are unreadable, you are untouchable. Machiavelli understood this. He believed that men who defend themselves too quickly reveal their fear, and once fear is visible, control is lost. But the man who remains silent during accusation doesn't appear afraid. He Appears composed dangerous, a mind still calculating. A player who has not shown his final hand, that's the man who survives the arena. Not by winning the argument, but by never stepping into it. So the next time the world demands your voice, pause, because in the silence, you become the author of mystery, and mystery always outranks apology. There's an apology that doesn't say, "I'm sorry," it says, "I'm broken." It doesn't ask for forgiveness, it demands it, not through words, but through emotional manipulation. It reframes the dynamic not to admit guilt, but to shift control. This is the reversal, a psychological sleight of hand where the wrongdoer becomes the wounded. The one who caused pain becomes the one now needing comfort, and in doing so, they gain something far more powerful than forgiveness. They gain leverage. It usually begins with a phrase like, "I hate myself for what I did to you," or, "I can't believe I hurt someone like you. I don't deserve your kindness." It sounds remorseful, it sounds vulnerable. But look closer. The spotlight has moved. It's no longer on the person who was harmed. It's now on the person who did the harming and their apparent emotional suffering. This isn't resolution, it's a bait and switch. Victim, who was once standing in moral clarity, is now subtly recast as the person who must respond to another's guilt. Their pain gets overshadowed by someone else's regret. They're no longer allowed to fully express their anger, because now they're being asked quietly, invisibly to console the one who inflicted the pain. This is the genius of the fake apology. It works because most people are conditioned to respond to vulnerability. When someone expresses self-loathing, the instinct is to soothe, not interrogate. And in that moment, the tables turn. The manipulator becomes the one being cared for now. The original offense becomes a bonding mechanism. The wound is no longer a fracture in the relationship. It's the new foundation. The one who was hurt feels they must now protect the new fragile version of their abuser. And just like that, loyalty is born out of guilt. This is emotional engineering at its highest level, and it doesn't stop at one-on-one dynamics. Public figures do this masterfully. A politician embroiled in scandal appears on television with tears in their eyes, not saying, "I was wrong, but I failed to live up to the standard I set for myself." They don't confess to the harm, they highlight their personal disappointment. The public, so eager to see humility, misreads the script. They see vulnerability and confuse it for accountability, and because they want a redemption arc, they start building it for them. The audience says, "He's changed, he sees it now. That must have taken so much courage." But what actually happened is far more calculated. He baited them into emotional investment. Once you believe someone has changed, you become emotionally committed to protecting that new version of them. To challenge them again feels like betrayal. This is how the fake apology becomes a tool not just for survival, but for control. And the most dangerous part, this tactic doesn't look like manipulation. It looks like healing. It masquerades as closure, but it's actually a reframe. The goal isn't forgiveness, it's submission. Because now, if the victim dares to stay angry, they seem cruel. If they bring up the pain again, they're accused of being stuck in the past. But he said he was sorry. Can't you move on? The fake apology has now inoculated the manipulator from future criticism. It doesn't resolve conflict. It renders the other person powerless to name it again. This is why the best manipulators don't fight. They confess carefully, with precision. They apologize not to equalize, but to dominate more subtly. Their apology becomes a shield, a prop, a performance designed to create just enough softness to slip back in. And once they're back in, they're harder to remove, because now they're seen not just as flawed, but as redeemed. And we protect our redeemed figures fiercely. Once someone has grown, to criticize them becomes an attack on the very idea of growth. People will defend their transformation more than they ever defended their innocence. This is how the apology, done strategically, creates emotional confusion. It shifts the narrative from what happened to how dare you keep bringing it up, from offense to offense at being questioned, from wrongdoing to moral positioning. Abused becomes the comforted. The accuser becomes the aggressor. The apology becomes not a healing tool, but a psychological trapdoor. And in this reversal, the manipulator wins twice. First, by gaining forgiveness they never earned. Second, by making the other person question if they were ever really right to begin with. This isn't accountability, it's emotional warfare, and it's devastatingly effective. Because it plays on our deepest instincts to forgive, to connect, to believe people can change. But Machiavelli would warn us, never take transformation at face value, observe the aftermath. Does the person who apologized relinquish control, or did they just find a new way to hold it? If they emerge from apology stronger, more loved, more defended, and harder to criticize, they didn't apologize to lose power, they apologized to increase it. Apologies are loud, reframing is quiet. But where apology hands over control, reframing rewires it. The moment someone expects you to surrender through confession, and you don't, you introduce discomfort. That discomfort becomes confusion. And that confusion becomes power. This is the art of emotional reframing, silent reshuffling of roles that allows you to hold your ground without being labeled defensive or cruel. It's not denial, it's not aggression, it's something more elegant. Psychological redirection. Most people collapse under blame. They either grovel or fight. But there's a third path. One, Machiavelli would have taken neither defense nor apology, but narrative disruption. When someone confronts you with emotional pressure, they expect one of two things, guilt or resistance. But what happens when you give them neither? They say, "You hurt me." You respond, "That wasn't my experience, but I hear that it was yours." Now the spotlight splits. You haven't validated their story, but you haven't rejected it either. You've created space for emotion without confessing to a crime. That's the first layer of reframing. Next, you shift the structure of the interaction. They want a clear villain. You introduce complexity. There's more to this story than either of us can fully explain in one moment. Now you're not a defendant, you're a philosopher, and philosophers don't confess, they invite inquiry. This is how you pivot the power dynamic, from one of confession to one of curiosity, and curiosity disarms faster than remorse in emotional aikido. The idea isn't to block force, but to absorb and redirect. Reframing is emotional aikido. You don't meet confrontation head on, you sidestep, you mirror, you deflect, and the energy they threw at you, it returns to them, unusable. Instead of "I'm sorry, I made you feel that way," say, "I can tell this was painful for you, that matters to me." You've acknowledged the emotion, not the accusation. You've engaged without submitting. The blame now floats unanchored, and with no anchor, it has no impact. This is the subtle genius of reframing. You shift the terrain of the conversation, from morality to perception, from judgment to exploration. The moment they feel uncertain, they lose the moral high ground, and you, without ever raising your voice or lowering your position, regain command of the room. It works in relationships, it works in boardrooms, it works in interviews, and it works because it gives people the illusion of emotional connection without ever handing over control. Think of it this way. Apologies beg for approval, reframes challenge the premise. Someone says, "You acted out of ego." You respond, "That's one way to look at it, but there were many moving parts that day." You've neither confirmed nor denied. You've offered a fog, a respectful haze where certainty can't thrive. Fog is frustrating to the aggressive, but it's safe to the crowd. The public doesn't want explosive denial. They want balance, and when you reframe with precision, you appear composed, thoughtful, even wise. This is how Machiavellian tacticians avoid crucifixion in the moral age. They don't stand trial. They rewrite the courtroom. They never say, "I didn't do it." They say, "What matters most is how we move forward." They never say, "I'm innocent." They say, "There are always layers to any decision." These aren't evasions, they're strategic ambiguities. And ambiguity is unkillable, because as long as they can't define you, they can't control your framing. Also introduces self-awareness without surrender. One powerful tactic is to place yourself in the story without placing yourself beneath it. Looking back, I can see how this may have been perceived differently than intended. Now you're the analyst, not the accused. You're reviewing the tape, not apologizing for it. The beauty of these tactics is their subtlety. They don't trigger defenses. They don't escalate, but they shift emotional authority from the accuser to the person who remains calm. And that calm is magnetic, because in a room full of emotional heat, the coolest mind always leads. The difference between losing control and owning the room isn't in what you say. It's in how you frame the moment. Apologies collapse the frame. Reframing expands it. You're not saying, "I'm wrong." You're saying, "It's more complicated than blame allows." And in that complexity, people stop pointing fingers. They start looking inward. They question their narrative. They slow down. And once they slow down, you lead. Reframing is not about being right. It's about staying in charge of perception, because the one who controls the frame controls the future. There's a secret to survival that few ever master, not the art of apology, but the art of resurrection, not through words, not through groveling, not through begging for forgiveness, but through power. This is the path Machiavelli would choose. Not to correct the story, but to outgrow it, because in the court of public perception, you don't erase guilt by defending yourself. You erase it by becoming too powerful, too useful, too relevant to ignore. The fallen man who apologizes becomes a character in someone else's narrative. The fallen man who evolves writes a new script entirely. Disgrace is only permanent if you stay still. If you try to fight perception directly, you only reinforce it. The harder you try to explain, the deeper you sink into the role they've assigned you. That's the trap, thinking that clarity is what frees you. But the public doesn't remember explanations. They remember impact. If your name is tied to failure, the only way to shift the association is not with an apology, but with undeniable achievement. It begins with disappearance, not as an escape, but as a strategic retreat. You vanish not in weakness, but in preparation. Behind the scenes, you rebuild, not just your skills or reputation, but your frame. The way you walk back into the world must be so refined, so elevated, that the past version of you becomes unrecognizable when you re-enter. You say nothing. You don't remind them of the fall. You don't try to undo the narrative. You simply replace it. You walk back into the spotlight, not as someone who survived scandal, but as someone who outpaced it. And that's when the shift happens. The public doesn't like to admit it was wrong. So instead of revising their judgment, they revise your identity. They pretend your fall never happened, not because they forgive, but because it no longer makes sense. They can't punish what no longer fits their judgment. A man who is thriving, who commands attention, who builds something greater than the mistake, he becomes too complex to categorize. People don't destroy what they don't understand. They admire it or they follow it. The world forgives slowly, but it forgets fast, if forgetting serves its convenience. History proves this. Look at those who were once disgraced celebrities, leaders, thinkers who returned not with press tours or apology videos, but with silence and mastery. They built, they released something powerful. They outperformed the stain, and soon enough, they weren't the one who failed. They were the one who came back stronger than ever. This is the Machiavellian blueprint. Never ask to be accepted again. Instead, become the version of yourself that forces their silence. That's what real redemption looks like. Not mercy, but irrelevance of the past. And here's the paradox. When you rise without apology, you give the crowd an exit from their own judgment. They no longer need to justify your fall. They just quietly adjust to your new status. People hate being wrong, but they love being close to power. If your success outweighs your guilt, they will realign themselves, not out of respect, but out of instinct. This is the law of narrative gravity. The bigger your new impact, the weaker their old story becomes, until one day, they don't even reference it. You're no longer the one who messed up. You're the one who overcame, not because you told them, but because you showed them without saying a word. And if you do this right, something remarkable happens. They not only accept your return, they celebrate it. They start to claim they believed in you all along. They retell your story with new language. They shift the spotlight from your fall to your rise. Because it reflects better on them, they don't want to feel like they missed the comeback, so they pretend they were always rooting for you. That's the trick. Don't fight to change their memory. Change their investment. Give them a new version of you that feels more valuable than holding on to the past. And the moment your presence outweighs your past, they will rewrite history to fit you, so disappear not in shame, but in strategy. Rebuild, not for their forgiveness, but for your leverage. Return, not to apologize, but to render the apology obsolete. And when you do, let your success speak in a language their guilt never could, because Machiavelli didn't believe in redemption through admission. He believed in resurrection through power. You've been told that honesty wins, that if you own your mistakes, people will respect you, that if you're transparent, the world will offer redemption. But history tells a different story, and real power never follows the rules of moral storytelling, because in the world of perception, truth is not currency. Frame is you don't win by being right. You win by controlling the meaning of what right even is. And once you realize this, everything changes. The apology becomes less a noble gesture and more a strategic error, not because guilt is meaningless, but because confession makes you visible, and what's visible is vulnerable. What's defined can be attacked. Most powerful men and women don't confess, they construct. They don't explain themselves. They evolve slowly, quietly, without needing to be understood, because they understand something deeper. You don't win by being forgiven. You win by becoming too powerful to criticize. This is the Machiavellian principle, the ultimate frame control. If they can't pin you down, they can't punish you. If they can't explain you, they can't own your story. And if your comeback is undeniable, louder, sharper, cleaner than your mistake, they won't care what you did. They'll only care what you've become. Forgiveness is cheap, but dominance is remembered, and that's what the apology costs you. Not just momentary power, but the myth of strength, the mythology of composure, the reputation built not on what's said, but on what's implied. There's a reason the unkillable man never explains himself, not because he has nothing to say, but because explanation gives away the mystery, and mystery is leverage. He lets others speak, he lets them speculate, he lets them obsess, because their obsession is attention, and attention, properly managed, is control. Apologizing means surrendering the frame. You accept their view of the story. You step into their architecture of judgment. You become a case study, something for them to analyze, forgive, or discard. But if you never step into that courtroom, if you never even acknowledge the accusation, you stay above it. Not in denial, not in delusion, in command, because the moment you try to win through moral clarity, you're already playing a game designed to make you lose. There will always be a flaw in your apology, a hole in your logic, a tone they didn't like, and they will never be satisfied. That's the dark truth of public morality. It's not about truth, it's about submission, and submission never ends. So what's the alternative? You outgrow the accusation, you redefine the context, you become someone so necessary, so relevant, so unstoppable, that the past becomes a footnote to your present. You win not by being understood. You win by being unavoidable. No viral tweet, no press statement, no tearful confession, just results. That's how you make them forget. Not by asking, not by pleading, but by becoming the version of yourself that doesn't need their permission to exist in the Machiavellian world. Remorse is not a virtue, it's a tool. You never offer it unless it buys you more than it costs. You never show it unless it protects your position or unlocks a gate that strength cannot breach. Every other apology is a tax on your reputation, a discount on your influence, a signal to the world that you're still waiting for their approval, and approval is a leash, so walk away from it, because the future doesn't belong to the forgiven, it belongs to the unapologetic, the composed, the complex, the man or woman who's Silence speaks louder than guilt ever could. You don't win by saying you've changed. You win by changing so completely that the old story no longer fits, so if you must apologize, do it with a plan. Do it as a strategy, and if you don't have a strategy, don't say a word. If you found this exploration of Stoicism inspiring, please like the video, subscribe to the channel for more philosophical insights, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement helps us continue to bring you content that enriches your life. Thank you for watching.